All right. You're not in charge. Test. Test, test. There we are. All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Redevelopment Agency Board meeting of the 27th of November, 2018. We're going to kick off this meeting with general comments to the Board of Directors. Just by way of information for those listening at home or tuning in after the fact, we do accept written comment either in person or mailed to us at 451 South State, Suite 418. You can come speak to us in person and take your 2 minutes, and that's what we will do right this moment. If anybody in the audience would like to speak to the Redevelopment Agency Board of Directors, speak now. Raise your hand. We will hand you a card to fill out so we can capture your name and contact information. But is there anybody in the audience who would like to take this moment to give us your opinion? Nada. All right. In that case, we're going to move on to item B, which is our public hearing. So we are going to move toward budget amendment number 2. Do we have any cards? No cards. All right. In that case, I will look for a motion to close this public hearing. So moved. It's been moved by Board Member Luke and a second by Board Member Johnston. All those in favor? That motion carries, so we are closed, and we are moving right along to item C1, the approval of minutes for the 9th of October, 2018. Look for a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Board Member Fowler and Board Member Fowler moved to approve the minutes, seconded by Board Member Luke. All those in favor?
Aye.
And now we are on to item C2, the affordable. Let's see. I actually took the liberty to reorganize our agenda somewhat. So we're going to start off with public hearing. Let's see. We're going to move on to the station area plan update. And for that conversation, we have, let's see who we have at the table. Thank you. We have Susan Lundmark and Danny Waltz, as well as our consultants, Eric Ost and Benji Becker. So welcome to the mic, you guys. Danny, would you like to tee this up for us?
I will, as we're loading up. This is a process that the agency has undertaken. Suze is here to kind of give you some background, but essentially what we are presenting to you this afternoon is a summary of the process for creating the Station Center area plan, as well as its findings in terms of recommendations for development potential. So I'll let Suze expand on that a little bit and introduce our consultants.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having us. We're excited to present. As stated in the packet, this project is a partnership with Utah Transit Authority, and it stems from a grant that the RDA received from Wasatch Front Regional Council back in 2017. And we're lucky to have our consultant team here today, Eric Ost from Urban Design Associates out of Pittsburgh, and Benj Becker from Zions Public Finance to take us through the presentation. And we also have Kevin Leo from UTA in the audience and Megan Townsend from Wasatch Front Regional Council as part of our project team. And Eric will take us through the presentation. It shows it's the result of significant community outreach and engagement effort. And the presentation, a lot of the information was presented to the public in August of this year. So just to kind of set the stage. And I'm going to let Eric talk.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you very much to the board for the
Eric, before you jump in, I'm going to go to Board Member Mendenhall for a quick question.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to know if you all have had a chance to see the policy questions that our staff has come up with regard to the station center.
My apologies to the board. We sent those around internally because they were put together kind of informally.
And that's okay. Sometimes
So,
that happens.
yeah.
Sometimes they're sent to you. So
Yeah. Sorry about that.
I will listen to your presentation. Anything I don't get answered, I'll ask later.
Thank you. Sorry about that. And we can forward them to staff later. So.
Sure, and we'll try to be brief to allow plenty of time for questions. So, as Susan mentioned, this is part of a partnership between the UTA and the RDA, and Wasatch Front Regional Council was was funding this effort. The team was engaged to study very specific parcels, which are shown in full color here, but also kind of a light touch or general recommendations for the whole district to look comprehensively at the district. So this could be one neighborhood that included open space improvements and infrastructure improvements as well. This consultant team that was chosen, UDA, we're the lead. My name's Eric Ost, principal in charge of this project. We also have Alta Planning and Design, and Ben Becker is here from Zions Bank, as Susan mentioned. Our steering committee included Salt Lake City divisions of planning, transportation, housing, and neighborhood development, and the parks and public lands. Our project schedule included 3 processes. We always do these same 3 processes every time.
Eric,
yes.
sorry to cut you off once more, but would you, we're having a hard time with the volume, so if you could
Yeah.
just hold that mic right up,
Absolutely.
that'd be
I'll get a
great.
little closer. How about that? We always work on three different phases of our project. Our first project, part of the project always includes listening. We're just kind of all community input. We had a session where we were here for a week working with all the stakeholder groups in May. We had a second session in July where we did a public workshop of testing, and then now we're in the deciding phase. We call it our finalizing our plan, and that's where we're looking forward to feedback from you. We met with nearly 200 stakeholders, approximately 200 stakeholders. We interviewed over 100 transit riders on the station platform. We also asked these 3 questions of everyone. What are the strengths of the neighborhood? What are the weaknesses? And what are the opportunities? As a way to open the door for conversation for a broad range of things, but it also gave us materials that are comparable from one group to another. Through this effort, we developed a series of design principles which are really around these 3 major bullets. Connecting. This is a great opportunity to create a walkable neighborhood with a short walk to open spaces from within. Improve connectivity between downtown and the west neighborhood, but also from this neighborhood to downtown and to West Salt Lake City. Adding value, including daily needs and amenities for current residents. Address the need for housing and housing choices for all. And finally, embracing transit, locating density and intensity at these transit nodes, and also improving the UTA rider experience for everyone, and attracting people to the neighborhood. The community feedback is in this diagram here, which at first sight it may look a little bit of a scattershot diagram. The greens are the strengths, and you can see them clustering around Pioneer Park, the Gateway, and the Arena. The reds are what we call the weaknesses, which are around 200 South, some of the homelessness issues that were pointed out in the neighborhood, and some of the rail crossings got a lot of red dots. And then the blues were areas for opportunities where we wanted to be focusing on, and you could see the blues clustering on a lot of the project sites that we were working on, including Pioneer Park as well. So these were things to direct us into our effort through the public process. So our general approach became to look north at the North Temple site as a TOD, a high-density residential neighborhood. There's a strong residential momentum in that neighborhood today. In the middle, what we were calling the 1st and 6th neighborhood, kind of in the tradition of a lot of the neighborhood centers of Salt Lake City, 9th and 9th, 15th and 15th, and so on, but a mixed density, mixed-use neighborhood centered around the arts. And then finally, at the Central Station TOD, a high-density office and residential neighborhood, then again focused on transit to the south. One of the things that was interesting about this process is when we were engaged, we thought that we would be obviously providing those specific design for those UTA and those RDA parcels, but we thought that we would be needing to figure out what might be going on in the neighborhood and new efforts and new issues. But one of the things that came boiled right up through the process is that there are a lot of initiatives that are underway today from the city. And these initiatives really are around these items: Pioneer Park, homelessness resources, the Rio Grande Depot, Station Center, 200 South, Folsom Trail, the Arena Gateway, 5th West, 6th West, and all of these together making a patchwork around our three major planning areas. I'm going to run you through each of these individually. Pioneer Park is obviously at the southeast corner. There's been a lot of discussion about Pioneer Park. I don't need to spend much today, but we feel like this is a really critical component for the success of the neighborhood and for all of downtown Salt Lake. It's absolutely a catalyst, and one of the feedback items that we heard from a number of folks was that the lack of open space in the neighborhood. And obviously there's current improvements going on today, right now, and then there are more in plan for in the future. Continuing to address the homelessness, another issue that we recognize has been a major point of discussion here. There's a lot of homelessness resource centers in the neighborhood today, and we recommend that obviously that the city continues to address this homelessness issue with a city and a statewide effort. The Rio Grande connection, the Rio Grande Station building is really kind of a blessing, and I don't even want to use the word curse because it's not, I don't want to use anything pejorative, but it was symbolically the end of 3rd South. And one of the issues now is that the station is beyond, the current station they're using is beyond it, so it in some ways is a major landmark, but getting around that station can somewhat, if you can make strong direct connections, you will find revitalization working that direction. So connections around Rio Grande Station is a major impediment, or is currently an impediment, is a major opportunity for making Station Center, the planning for Station Center, the current RDA plans here, work in the future. So we're recommending multiple connections around the Rio Grande Depot today. The 500 West Park blocks, this is another effort that's been going on. There's a task force that's reviewed a number of alternatives, and they have picked a pedestrian focused alternative. Funding is required for the interim phase 1, which has the green space, and the complete phase 2 road realignment. This is in the 3 to 5 year time window. At the end of this process, we're going to put this together into a kind of series of a timeline initiatives in order to kind of catalyze development and work together.
Eric, can I ask you a quick question, Mr. Chair? On that one, was there a traffic study done in coordination with that exploration?
Yes, yeah. There was a traffic study done for this. This particular effort, we were not specifically involved in the design, but we were made aware of all the different the alternatives, and we met with the design team that did the 3 alternatives and shared with them with us, and then we offered our opinion to what would be the most pedestrian oriented, which did not factor in the selection of this that was going on separately, and the one that the task force did select was one that has the best pedestrian connectivity across it, and we were supportive of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jennifer Bruno.
Just to add, I think the part of the design funding was initially funded by the RDA for that specific project. So I would imagine, and it said there that phase 1 funding would be required for phase 1, and so you could speak about it specifically as an RDA board if they came back for funding request for phase 1. So.
The 200 South improvements, we heard a significant amount of 200 South and North Temple are the 2 major connectors through the neighborhood today. It's really challenging to get past I-15, and this is one of them. We heard about the traffic conditions there, but it's also used by bikes and pedestrians, and it's not a very hospitable place and creates a barrier from the north and south to the neighborhood. We heard a considerable amount of the opportunity to green that space, add medians or more trees to encourage walkability and improvements to the center, to this particular piece, which is a geographic center of the neighborhood. Building and connecting the Folsom Trail is another important connection of adding a kind of 3rd connection and really connecting West Salt Lake into downtown. This is a bike and pedestrian connector and part of a Tiger grant that's underway and anticipated construction by 2022. Enhancing the arena and gateway, we don't need to say much about this. They're doing extremely well right now. We're seeing more work within the gateway today. We are very much in supportive of that, and the idea is of the work that we're doing around it is to do things that are complementary to the gateway, so the gateway is part of a whole system in a whole neighborhood rather than one individual place. The 500 West connector underneath North Temple, we see that the North Temple station is a station that really deserves a front door. It's a bit of it has incredibly high ridership, but not a great station experience. And the city shared with us some of the design, the CAD work to connect 500 West underneath North Temple And we're a major supporter of that, of giving that station a front door, but funding needs to be secured for this to move forward. The 600 West is the major north-south spine in the center of the neighborhood. Infrastructure varies wildly up and down this street, and as you can see in the diagram, all of the yellow parcels are specific planning areas, and all of them are connected to 6 West. So in many ways, this is kind of the secret kind of piece to this of making this work, is improving 600 West for everyone. It's also a major cut through from the neighborhood for people that are trying to get going from West Salt Lake. They come across 200 West and they go north on that to pick their street as they connect through. So it's a kind of key connector. Yes.
One thing that stood out to me that wasn't mentioned here was the rail, the cut through right here. This seems to be a huge barrier in the neighborhood, right on 6 West and
On
about
6
South
West.
Temple.
Yes.
The rail crossing there.
This one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you ever use this road, sometimes you can be stuck there for 45 minutes or longer.
Yeah.
And that seems to be something that needs to be addressed in this area.
One of the things that we were having trouble with that one too, because it would need a major infrastructure improvement to do so. So I think for one thing is that if you're on the south side, using 500, that connector would be a key piece. And then, so that would be one thing. As a pedestrian, a bicyclist, key wayfinding issues would be important. And then the third item, one of the things that we'll talk about in a moment, was that we feel that this is an opportunity for a bridge over right into the central station area, so that if you're caught by this train here as opposed to here, you can still make it across as a bicyclist or a pedestrian as well. But you're absolutely right. This is a real challenge. It's right in the heart of the neighborhood, and it can be a long wait for sure, both from in any mode of transportation. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about the 3 sites that we were asked to provide specific design for. This is the North Temple Station site. It's on either side of the North Temple Viaduct, and again, they all address on 6th West. The interesting part is that the back of the site is right up against the station. So in many cases, the station is right there, even though you can't access it from there. We provided a design where all of the buildings really have to have kind of front doors on all sides, but what we're doing is we've recommended that the creation of a new street through the north side of the parcel with a green space very close to the station, with access up to the top of the bridge and over and across. The other thing we're recommending is that there be a way to slip through as a pedestrian, as a cyclist, or as a car, to make this one neighborhood together with residential on the south side of North Temple. Each side of the site has its own open space. We heard considerable amount from the folks that we were interviewing that open space is an issue. So we made that as a part of all of the designs. This is about over 500 units and 500 square feet of neighborhood serving retail. This is a view looking from that green space. The rail is behind you. This is kind of looking northwest. The 1st and 6th neighborhood site, this is again a kind of arts-focused mixed-use district. This would require a collaboration between property owners, including UTA, RDA, and some of the current owners. There's a potential program of up to 500 multifamily units, 350,000 square feet of office, 40,000 square feet of cultural or arts uses on the ground level of these, and 5,000 square feet of neighborhood retail. The idea is to really try to build on the existing momentum that the site has today as an arts destination, and with the current uses in place, and then creating a new kind of neighborhood park to the south that addresses to 6 West, but at the same time focused on the station, central station below, as it's only a few blocks away. And this is a kind of aerial view. This is 6th here, I-15 at the north side, and this is the rail tracks behind it with a Folsom Trail connecting through at the north side, and what this might look like from an aerial perspective. We're trying to decrease the use of parking and trying to consider that a new open space here would be something that would be kind of the living room for this particular neighborhood. Adding a green space and a park space would be
Board
important.
Member Mendenhall.
Eric, will you orient me a little bit more? I see the curve on the
Yeah, so this is
north
looking,
end.
if we're in this corner, we're looking this way. There's the rail and the open space. So
south.
it's this direction. Yeah, so this is 6th, and this is 2nd south here, and this is the rail, and this is the I-15 here. So this is north, is on the right side of the drawing.
So that is 1st south, directly to the right. Okay.
This is the current, the Utah Arts Alliance is located right around here right now. Green Team is right about here, and there's some existing uses right here on this location. Sure. The central station site here is the site to the largest parcel to the south. UTA Clean Fuel Center is going on right now at this place, this location here, Greyhound Station here, and this is the current heavy rail tracks as they are today. This site has a lot of challenges, particularly in the geometry of the site, but there's great opportunity at the same time. It really bookends the current station center planning to the east, and a real opportunity to signal that this is the major moment in the plan, and to really capitalize that this is the significant station for Salt Lake City. The potential program is approximately 250 multifamily units on this corner building. In the station itself, what we've kind of positioned is that it would be ideal to have an internal station and a station environment that's conditioned. So the idea is to build things on top of it and to capitalize on that. So you basically get a station for free, or not for free, but as part of the deal. A lot of the great stations, when you look historically, the great station, both designs, but also stations that have made it through, have been stations that have done that. They've put some sort of office building or some sort of use on top of it. The great Pennsylvania station of New York City was torn down because it was in a major city block with nothing on top of it, is really why it was torn down. So taking a page out of that, do what a lot of museums are doing this today. They're building, residential and office buildings right on top of their museums to be part of that. So this would be an opportunity here to create an office and a residential kind of prototype for what could be taken to other areas in the region as well. So we've put 200,000 square feet of office. I think we estimated from what our discussions with UTA, they would need about 100,000. So there'd be 100,000 there for associated businesses that might want to be located next to them. And then a residential building here. That would be about 100 multifamily units that would have zero parking, transit passes, bike parking, and be a new model for how people will live on top of stations in Salt Lake. We have options for potential office space over here instead of a garage. We have a bridge that would cut across as well in our kind of recommendations here, and recommendations that could include different ways to handle the Greyhound station. The rendering here, this is looking east, so we're on top of the rail below here. You can see the heavy rail. This is kind of what would be the base of the station, kind of the lobby environment. UTA would be in this office building, maybe the top 5 floors. In the traditions of many of the stations, the Rio Grande and the Union Pacific, we put kind of the signage on the building for UTA. This is the apartment building, or the residential building that would be associated with this transit-oriented development, and be something that you'd see against the sky. When you're looking at a distance, you'd know that was the station. So from downtown, you could see the station as well. Phasing, as we mentioned, there was a lot of initiatives that are already underway, and one of the things that we wanted to do was to offer an opportunity to think about how these phasing alternatives are important into helping catalyze these for development. So in the sequencing, in the 0 to 3 years, we're recommending the North Temple Station move forward. There's a considerable amount of momentum up there. Pioneer Perk is under improvements, and then the Rio Grande Station connector would be important to getting people to know that this station is there and that this is a place that they can access easier than they can today. The kind of teal color, green color, is in the 3 to 5 years. That includes 6 West and the 1st and 6th Phase 1, the Folsom Trail, and so forth. And then a lot of the internal part of Station Center and the corner of the residential corner of the central station site. And then finally, in the 5-year window, would be the final central station in the station center itself. That's based on what we know about funding and what we know about direction. So,
Erin Mendenhall, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric, talk to me about the 3 to 5 year sequencing. I mean, we've had an opportunity sitting here for a long time, so I'm grateful on the one hand for what is really an expedited sort of forecast, and on the other hand, we have a project area that's expiring shortly in this time frame, and I wonder about the motivators on this timeline. Is it so much that it's the project area expiration, which is something that this board can adjust at any time, and also I think in looking at the 5-year area, that's where I feel like our focus has been, because we own quite a bit of that land. So I'm curious about that being in the later stages of the development.
I think it's an excellent question. In terms of I can't speak to necessarily the timing out of the items you mentioned, but from what we understand and from what we learned from the city is that in a lot of our discussions is that this is what was feasible in a reasonable time frame. So we were kind of thinking about what are kind of key to one item catalyzing another. I think that if it was possible, obviously, the sooner you could move up some of those from the 5-year up to the 3 to 5 year would be ideal, and anything to speed up the process would be important.
So the staging of those potential projects, was there an eye toward the generation of increment based on and fueling the subsequent projects?
No.
That seems like something
That would
we
be.
might want to consider.
Yeah.
With the project area expiring within 5 years, it's unlikely that any of these projects would really see any dollars coming from reimbursement. So if we were going to have that as a opportunity for participation, we'd likely have to extend the project area. So,
And I think, sorry, go ahead.
By all means.
I think that given the board's role as the board of the RDA in creating new project areas, it might make sense if you see a project that's worthy of interest. If the board's willing to consider a new project area for the accomplishment of that project, you might want to say something now, and then the staff can kind of fold that into the work going forward. So,
I guess that also leaves a question as well. We had a little bit of a dialogue yesterday, Danny, but do you anticipate the RDA board adopting this formally, this plan? And I don't mean to jump the gun. I know you have
This is the
a few
last
more
slide,
slides,
so it's a good time to do it.
But I mean, what role does the board play in this plan overall, or the council for that matter?
I think the role for the board at this point would be to accept the plan. The idea today is to gather any comments that you would like to see incorporated into the final plan. And then for us as an agency, you're essentially just accepting the work of the consultants in the plan. And then the process from there moving forward is depending on what the final version is of the plan. We will then start having discussions with the planning staff in terms of whether any of those recommendations or the implementation strategies require and or would be better served if there were necessarily changes that needed to be made to either the zoning or the current master plan. If there's not, if everything's already provided for and we can do this with what's in place and the initiatives moving forward, then our role with this plan is really just to help us guide development of the agency's properties and doing that in a way that coordinates with UTA.
Okay. I'll let you finish if you have final thoughts, Eric.
Thank you. Yeah, we're actually pretty close to the end of the presentation. So just as a summary, the development potential, which is important to all of us, the residential, you could develop up to 1,400 units. In terms of your residential goals, this is almost 10% of the entire Salt Lake City area in one neighborhood. Getting people living here is going to be an important component to the feeling of safety and the kind of feeling that this is a place that's lived in, which was some of the feedback we got. Approximately 250,000 square feet of office, 40,000 square feet of cultural uses at the ground level, and about 15,000 square feet of kind of neighborhood serving retail that's meant to complement what's going on in the gateway and to create kind of one neighborhood. So that's really the final slide. So
Great. Board members, do you have any questions? Andrew Johnson, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that. If you can go back to a previous slide of the overall.
this one? Or?
Maybe one more back. There, that's fine. I appreciate most of the plan, and I understand most of it. I think the connections piece is still a little vague for me in some ways. I know it's very expensive to do elevated crossings over railroad tracks on 2nd particularly.
Yeah.
Folsom Trail there is funded, but it's only funded for a basic.
That's right.
It's not the full trail. It's
That's
the
right.
basic sort of
Yeah.
asphalt overhead,
Yeah.
right? And it still runs into that at-grade crossing there on 6th. So the discussion has been for a long time on 4th.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't see that included in here at all because that's the elevated crossing from the west side of Salt Lake to the east.
Mm-hmm.
If the UTA Station Center is a major transportation hub, are there any thoughts about how do you use 4 South to connect the hub to the west side of Salt Lake City?
Mm-hmm.
Because right now there's a pedestrian walkway on 4th. There's no bike lanes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, right through there.
Mhm.
There was an idea at one point, do you do sort of a drop down from the apex down right to 6th? Are there any thoughts along those lines about how do you connect that?
We would be hugely supportive of that. I mean, in all of these conditions, I think you touched on it, is that connections are key. Salt Lake has really large blocks and mid-block connections and all of those kinds of things. But the challenging part, and you're going this way too, is that it's really expensive infrastructure to get elevated up to those kind of bridges and things like that. So anytime we can bring in discussions like that, we would be hugely supportive of that, particularly as this is as the connections through the neighborhood are so challenging. So we were fully focusing on the connections through the neighborhood, knowing that there's a lot of perimeter connections, but we would be absolutely in support of that particular connection as well.
I would ask maybe, I know this isn't the key piece of this plan, but this is the central station for the city. In a lot of ways, and if we're not talking, at least talking about 4 South as a connection point both east and west, I think we've been missing something. So I didn't see anything on here about that connection at all. In the near term, that's probably the only feasible way we're going to connect it, other than North Temple. So I'd just like to see that addressed in some capacity, at least saying there needs to be some pedestrian bike, some way to sort of use what we have right now or add to it. To make it more feasible.
Yeah, the tough thing, and we welcome the comment, and one of the tough things about the bridges is that generally they tend to be really tough in inclement conditions because you can't you can't tree canopy them, you can't cover them, or obviously that's only a certain number of months a year, but they also are tough to feel because you don't typically have like the street parking on the side that also become that pedestrian barrier. So we would put maybe the 2nd South and the Folsom Trail and as maybe important grade ones, and then we'd probably put the North Temple and the 4th as the kind of key bridge connections. So I think glad you brought that up. So we would absolutely add that in.
Board Member Mendenhall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is this a plan that the RDA or the council in some capacity might be asked to adopt? Or is this as far as it goes?
As I said, I think as far as the RDA board, because we funded a portion of it, I think it's a matter of whether we as a board want to at least accept its recommendations. It would not necessarily be a formal plan of the city or anything that we would necessarily accept as, a tactical plan, as much as it would be a plan that provided recommendations for how we would potentially move forward with marketing our property, and to the extent that when we do that, look to the opportunities of doing that in coordination with UTA and what is ultimately going to be the future property offerings for their pieces of property. And then I think the other thing that's important with this plan is the recommendations that they've stated in terms of the connections and coordination with a lot of the other initiatives that are currently in place. So
I think yes, and additional to what Jennifer Bruno was saying earlier, that if we as a board want to contemplate a new project area, and this piece of work could be some of those foundational components of a future area plan. Okay, so I guess to our chair and vice chair, I suppose we could anticipate future conversations about those kind of considerations in the full portfolio context of what the RDA has coming and what we've just recently approved. And then my other question is around, actually, it's on the median parking on 5th West and the recent investment we made there in 2017 with Salt Lake City Police Department utilizing part of that, but we don't have to get into that today. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. It's always, actually, I'm always very pleased with the work that your group does in different iterations around the city. So thanks for working on this one too.
Thank you very much.
Any further questions, board members? Nada? So Danny, is there any further steps with these consultants, or are we just looking for a straw poll today, or what would you like to see?
The goal of today, and Suze can jump in, and the consultants can too, if there's different direction that they're looking for, is just getting this input. I think the comments that we received, we'll go back and take a look at how we can incorporate those into the plan. We will then prepare a final draft of the plan, and then we can work with council staff and the board in terms of what extent they either want to approve that as a plan, accept the recommendations, what that really needs to look like from the RDA side. We will then have the conversation with the planning department to see if there's anything that was within this plan that we want to then look at other ways we can implement it within the city plans and recommendations or the code. And then if nothing else, we'll take a look at it and have it on available as we look to dispose of our property and work with UTA. So purpose of today was just to receive comments so that we can finalize it and then work with the board and what the next steps would be on how to officially accept or approve that.
Great. No further questions? Board Vice Chair Fowler, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to say to Eric and your team, you guys have done a really amazing job. And like since I first kind of started to get involved and we did the activity up in Danny's office and the amount of community outreach that you guys have done has really created something that I think is unique and will help us move forward in a positive way in that area that I think needs a little good positive push. And so I really appreciate all the work that you and your team have done on this great project. So
Thank you. Speaking on behalf of the team, this is a project we really enjoyed. We really love. We're lucky to have a lot of great projects, but this one was particularly fun to work on. We very much enjoyed it. Thank you.
because it was in Salt Lake.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you have your fingerprints all over this city, don't you? You gonna move here or what?
We've heard that before too.
Anything further, Danny?
That'll do it. Appreciate
Okay.
the input, and we'll
Great.
finalize the plan. Thank you.
Is there anything from Zion's Public Finance? Anything you'd like to add?
Nope, thank you also. We enjoyed this process very much.
Great. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to move along then.
Thanks.
And up next, we have the Block 67 facilitated process update. And for that, we have Siobhan, and let me find my agenda somewhere. All right. So we have Danny Waltz, Corinne Piazza, Siobhan Locke, and Allison Rowland from the council office. All right, Danny, back to you.
Okay, the board may remember that back in July, as we were having discussions with the board about the potential of a creation of a project area on Block 67, the board asked that the agency undertake a facilitator process to work with the various stakeholders. The point of that process was to essentially determine how to enhance the Japantown neighborhood that is surrounding that block, and specifically how to complement, recognize, and potentially incorporate that as part of the project. What we have for you today is a summary of that facilitation process and how we went about it. And so I will turn it over to Corinne, who will introduce the consultant and the team and give a little bit more information on the process and the background of what we did.
Great. Siobhan will speak first to the facilitated process, and then I'll go over our next steps, and then we'll answer any questions.
Thank you. So yes, we have undergone a facilitated process per your request to engage the stakeholders at Block 67. The process began, and so you have all gotten a copy of this, you've been transmitted this, but Corinne was nice enough to break it down really, really simply on this slide, but I'll go through a few of the details. So we went and we talked to all the major stakeholders, meaning the county, the Japanese American community, some of the property owners in the area, and various city departments, and also, of course, the Ritchie Group, who's the developer in the area. And that was really just about learning where everybody was starting and knowing where we should start the facilitated process, rather than just jumping right in to know what were the issues that were really important. And then what became clear after those interviews is that we really needed to have some deeper information sharing between the developer and the Japanese American community, that they hadn't had an opportunity to really sit down and talk things through. And so we had anticipated we would just jump right into a facilitated workshop, but that we took the time to stop and say, let's do this a little differently. And we had that information sharing session, which the result of that was a draft of this document. We learned a lot. We brainstormed about what could it look like, what would mitigate some of these areas where there was some conflict, and we came out of that with a draft. And I have to say, before I move on, that the stakeholders that we have involved have all been so great. The developer, everyone in the community, the staff, everybody was really, really willing, and really what we learned, even though we went in thinking that there was some really difficult things to move past, we thought, there was going to be some sticking points, and certainly there were, but I think everyone has some really great shared interest, including this board and the administration, who went in asking us to do the right thing, which I don't always get that direction, and I really, really appreciated that, and I think it did have a lot of influence on the outcomes that you'll see here. So I appreciate everyone's participation and because it's just been really, really exciting. So to pick up where I left off, so in that information sharing session, we came to the point that we thought we might, is that there's a couple of, and I think this board has heard before, that there are some concerns by the Japanese American community about the activation of First South and the design that was presented, and whether that would make First South, as thriving as they hope it would be. And certainly we talked through a lot of that, and Ritchie Group has been great to look at those specific issues and be really dynamic in coming up with ideas to address those within the Block 67 process. But what we also learned is, which was really interesting as we went forward, certainly, there was a short timeline, as there always is with these kind of things, and we learned as we went forward that there have been many processes that have been similar to this, with the expansion of the Salt Palace and with some other things. And so it really, it forced us to raise the bar a little bit with this process and say, how are we going to make this different, better, more implementable than and that's not to knock the processes that came before. They're certainly well-intentioned, and everyone wanted to do good things there, but I think we saw that as a challenge to really raise the bar and do even better, and push this just a little bit further so that we can get some meaningful steps forward here. And so I'll refer you to the slide here. So when we went into the bigger facilitated meeting, we had kind of a draft, and we had done all the brainstorming, I guess. And then we sat down in that meeting and learned a lot more about what it would look like. So with the county was there, all of the stakeholders were there, and we tried to really unpack what would it look like to do something with this list of brainstormed ideas. Things like, a grand entrance, or improvements to the road, things that you'll see all in the reports, improved lighting, economic development in the area, things like that. And we really looked at what it would take to implement those things, and to give this group something to really take and start to look at and potentially move forward. And what we learned is that the great thing is everybody's really passionate about it. What we also learned is that it's going to take more than just a couple of weeks of discussion to really help both development of the area move forward well, and in the way that Salt Lake City wants to see it go, and to see the Japantown not only just be preserved, but to help it to thrive. And so those are things that are going to take just a little bit more time. So if you look at the slide, I'll just take you through a little bit of that. Is what we talked about is kind of that focus one side, if you look at that, to mitigate the potential impacts of development, and that's kind of where we knew we were starting there. And what came out of that is, like I said, if you go down the short-term action items, the Ritchie Group has come up with all kinds of, jointly the group came up with all kinds of different things that could be done to mitigate, through this specific process, to mitigate some of the concerns about the activation of First South and what this development will do to activate the entire area. And so there's a whole list of those in the report that I'll refer you to in the short term. And then also during the same time frame, one of the things that the Ritchie Group moved forward is to connect their parking structure and the parking area that's owned by the temple, the Buddhist temple, and the Japanese Church of Christ, and to foster a future potential connection there. And so there has been some meaningful forward motion on that's been taken to each of their respective boards to try and move that forward. So that's kind of the potential mitigating side of things. And then that focus 2 is where we learned a lot about what needs to happen there to help the Japanese American community really better articulate and really unpack what it would take to make that Japantown a reality. In the short term, there's a recommendation to establish a working group, and this board has already done some action towards making that a reality, which is wonderful. And to also look at recognizing Japantown in the downtown master plan, because that's something that was an issue that was discussed in this group, as well as in the long term to have that working group be responsible for really articulating further what it would take to, for example, improve the road, or, have more of a Japantown presence. What exactly does that look like so that this board has something to act on? I think that is everything that I was going to talk about, and then I'll pass to Corinne to talk a little bit more about where that will go.
Great. So as Siobhan said, to kind of get past this list or brainstorm phase, we really have to start the heavy lifting of design and costing and implementation, which really requires a collaborative effort from all the stakeholders. So with that, the stakeholders arrived at the idea of this working group, and it's a really important step because it empowers stakeholders to lead the vision and create a continued space for collaboration, which is really important because, as you know, with visioning and implementation, it's a very fluid process, so there's a continued seat at the table to make sure those discussions keep happening and see that come to fruition. As far as the format, it's in draft phase, but our next step would be to hold a meeting with the stakeholders and finalize the details. They would include the logistics, how the group's going to operate. This can include everything from seats, at the working group, a timeline, and very importantly, checkpoints. So this isn't just an infinite group, but we have deadlines so that we're moving quickly and have shared goals throughout the process. It would also be setting goals so everyone's on the same page and we're working towards the same outcomes, and then determining a host as well. So with that, if the board agrees, our next steps would be to work with stakeholders to finalize what the working group looks like and how it operates, to work with the working group to hire a consultant. This lines up well with the funds that were put aside. So we want to make sure that we're not designing Japantown for the community, but we're designing it with the community. So that's a really important piece of the consultant working with the working group. And then also the board would recognize Japantown in the downtown master plan, or we'd work with that process. And the Japanese Church of Christ and Salt Lake Buddhist Temple their boards would continue to work with Ritchie Group on an approval of the short-term connectivity items that Siobhan mentioned and that are in the report. And then at this point, Siobhan's contract as facilitator would be complete unless otherwise directed, and we'd move forward with this process as needed and update the board as needed. There's a lot of work ahead, but we think this is the foundation that's needed to continue the collaborative effort and start that heavy lifting of making this vision come to fruition.
Oh, great. Thanks, Corinne. We're going to jump to board member questions really fast. I know we have one from Mendenhall and Fowler. Okay, we'll start with Amy Fowler.
Mine's less of a question and more just, I want to commend the RDA staff and Siobhan and the Japantown community members and the Ritchie Group. I think this process has been a long process and probably a very unique process for our city and for a development group and community, but it's been a process that has been so incredibly important to really moving forward and making sure, in my opinion, that our community members, both from our developing community and from Japantown and that community, feel valued and heard, and that we're working together. And it's hopefully something that we can use as a model as we continue to move forward. And as Siobhan said, it's not about, or I'm sorry, Corinne said this, not about building something for a community, but making sure that the community is there and we're building it with them. And I mean, I just cannot say the amount of work that you all have put into this has been incredible. And I know it wasn't something that was on the necessary, like, here's your list to do of things. It was more of, we're gonna throw this at you and we expect you to do a lot of work on it. So really from we've talked about it from our perspective. It's just been such a unique process and such an important one, and I can't thank all of you enough for really delving in and taking the efforts and the workload to do this for us, because I think we're really moving forward in a positive way there. So that's all I wanted to say was thanks. A huge shout out thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Board Member Mendenhall, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, please, thank you. My question, I want to thank you again. Amy did a good job thanking. But you mentioned the great participation by all the stakeholders involved, and I'm curious about that continued participation, particularly when I read the line in the staff report that the development can move forward prior to the entire Japantown vision being completed with the work group in place. And I'm wondering around what we might forfeit by allowing the development to move ahead before we really know what we need from the visioning process that does take time. So when I scroll down to 3B, that's referenced on your nice flow chart here also, which for my peers is on page 7 of 16. That's the section I'm looking at, where it talks about creating the placemaking and the ideas that are probable to come out, which may include things like street lighting and other enhancements to the area. And that's no surprise to anybody at this table that those are expensive propositions and that we usually involve neighboring property owners. Actually, we always involve neighboring property owners with those kind of enhancements. So when I'm talking, I appreciate that we have willing stakeholders right now in the process. I wonder about the willingness when we don't tie the participation component in a financial sense to the outcome that I think we all are very committed to with regard to the Japanese community here. And I think that the intention is sincere here, but if history is a predictor of the future, we need to be quite sure that we can guarantee these outcomes happen and come to fruition, because we haven't in the past as a city. And this community has not been well served by the developments surrounding them. I don't want that to happen again. And I think that we can talk about ways to do that, but in terms of moving ahead with a there are several steps, I understand, in the development process, and this isn't the last time that the Ritchie Group will be before this body in council or RDA format. But I want to know about that, and I think it's a curious recommendation that we allow the development to move ahead before we know what we're asking for.
Well, I would say from a stakeholder perspective, there's a lot of technical that Danny, I'm sure, will from a stakeholder perspective, I think that I like that the two are separated, because that doesn't mean that the Japantown ideas don't move forward if for some reason the development stalls, and vice versa, that the two can have independent lives, even though they are interdependent in a lot of ways. So from my perspective, that I think that there's benefit to be had there, but I know that there's a lot of other ramifications that Danny can talk about.
And one piece to that was the Ritchie Group had a lot of ideas around developing the Buddhist temple and the Japanese Church of Christ property, but they weren't ready to commit to that extent. So that referenced in a lot of ways setting up their development in a way that when the community was ready to develop their land, the connectivity was there, but they didn't necessarily wait until the churches were ready to develop their land, because it could be pretty far out.
Okay. Well, I do want to hear what you have to say, but with regard to that, that's regarding the private property ownership, and I'm talking about the public right-of-way improvements that are more. I can't imagine that the visioning process would contemplate the private property opportunities. That's not really the role of the city, or something I could see that we've been asking for funding around. But talk to me about the public investment.
Okay. I'll start by saying your comments are extremely accurate, because that's exactly kind of where we started with what we thought the goal of this process would be, is to understand exactly what we would need to do and or what components of the Ritchie Group development would need to be done to address the concerns of the Japanese American community. And this is where we as staff really appreciate the fact that we went through this process, because what we learned early on with Siobhan is that's not the end goal of what we're trying to do. It would be great if we could come to you today with a list of what we could do and what the cost would be, and that we would tell you that that's how it would make everyone happy. But what we actually heard and realized through the stakeholder process is what we really need is a process in and of itself, and that process needs to go through the steps that need to happen in due time. And so what you have here with the recommendation of doing a working group is to really figure out what the next steps are, and you as a board, I believe, are taking that action later today with the approval of our CIP funding, which includes the first step of that is the $100,000 to hire the consultant, and that consultant's role will essentially be to work with that working group to determine what we want to do, what components we want to include as part of those public infrastructure improvements, and what the cost would be. And then that process will also help us outline who the necessary parties are to do that and carry it out, whether that's the city, the agency, the developer, or arguably the other property owners on that street. Specifically to your point of whether we would miss an opportunity or not with the Ritchie Group, I don't think we would, because what we've been having in terms of our conversations with the stakeholders and the Ritchie Group is when we get to the point determining what the agency participation is going to be within this project, it'll be at that point that we come to this board and ask you to make sure that you are allocating a portion of those funds to do those improvements as we determine what they are under that study and with the working group. So I don't think we're going to miss an opportunity as much as what we're doing is we're setting the table in terms of what we think that process needs to be. And in all fairness to the Ritchie Group, they will tell you that they are but one property owner on both sides of that street, and arguably their participation probably needs to be a ratio of what the linear footage is. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind, because that's what, in my mind, puts it back on us as the agency to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's fair and equitable for all partners. That's why we started this process, and I think we owe that to the developer just as much as the rest of the stakeholders. So a lot of that burden will fall on us as the agency to really provide that plan, the costs, and lay out the path moving forward of if we want to do this, who are the stakeholders that need to take that on, how do we pay for it, and then what's the time frame. And so the basis for that comment within the staff report is understanding that the Ritchie Group's time frame is probably a lot faster than what we will do in terms of develop this study and really lay out the process. And so we want to be respectful of that. And I think this is a better way to do it. And that's, again, going back to the study, that's how we got to this point. And I think it's a much better process. But to your comment, you're absolutely right, because that's what we all want to make sure that as we do any participation agreement and we commit public funds, that we're doing it in a way that doesn't miss this opportunity, that we make sure we're incorporating everything we want to do as part of this project.
Thanks, Danny. And just in closing, I appreciate your comments about equity and fairness. I think it's absolutely appropriate. And I can't help but look down the road at the decisions we're going to have to make as a body regarding $15 million of our city's tax increment that was decided for us by another entity with regard to this project. Absolutely. So that absolutely is a layer in the cake of consideration.
Totally agree.
Thank you.
Board Member Mendenhall, can I build on that just briefly and maybe have a conversation with the rest of the board? Because I appreciate the work that has been done, and I can see that we still have more work to accomplish, but we are making decisions tonight, potentially, on this placemaking, this $100,000 for the consultant, which will provide design and scope and cost estimates and things of that nature. And I think that you do bring up a really interesting point about the development of this property itself moving forward, regardless. And so maybe there's an opportunity for us to really absorb what has happened so far with the articulated vision for Japantown. And, I'd like to, give them a nod in some capacity that the city is listening and interested in supporting this vision. And so I had an idea that, we could consider potentially doing a ceremonial resolution of sorts where we, as a body, make clear that we support the process and we are committed to finding a way to see this vision through in some way, in one way or another. We could do that today with the CIP. I think staff probably wouldn't be able to pull that resolution together that quickly, but we could look at maybe doing that next month for our RDA meeting. In addition to that, we are potentially creating a new CRA, and we could look at tying this vision to the creation of the new CRA as well. So I'd like to hear some feedback from board members on this, maybe get some direction. Board Member Rogers.
Yeah, I like the idea. My other question is, I mean, there's so many different timelines that this really could take, and I think we need to have something kind of laid out so we understand, you know, our options. If we decide to go this route, well, it's going to put, you know, it's going to screw, no, I don't want to say screw up, but it's going to screw up this line of going through the permitting process. So if we can come up with some ideas of how we can continue to keep the ball rolling, and I don't know if that's with the consultant, if that's through the hiring process, but I know that we have a lot of capable people in the RDA program that can figure that out.
Danny,
If I could speak to that real fast, I definitely agree. I think we're going to come back in terms of not only options, but we can certainly tie timeline to it. And I just want to follow up with something that Siobhan said, which is what really came out of this process is the idea that we really can move these on parallel paths, that they don't necessarily have to be tied to each other at each point. And arguably what we've done in terms of the recommendations from the consultant and the stakeholders is to set up a process that can be completely independent of anything that happens on the rest of Block 67 or the surrounding development. Arguably, it's a process that we really should just follow in terms of recognizing that community and how to incorporate that with what the city's doing, as well as the improvements that could be done independently and part of the project. And so, to your point, we certainly can set up what the different options are in the time frame. But ideally, this process, the beauty of it is it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to any development path or decisions that the board makes. We're hoping that this actually is already moving forward on its own path. So,
thanks, Danny. Other comments or feedback on the idea of a resolution?
I was just going to echo Amy's thank yous because I know that this is so important for residents, not just in this district, but all over Salt Lake. So thank you for committing to this long-term process.
Okay. Can I at least ask for a straw poll from board members on a resolution so we can give staff some signal on what they might be working on? All right, that's 7. Thank you very much. Okay, staff, do you have anything else? Danny, Corinne, Siobhan,
Mr. Chair?
Allison, Board Member Johnson.
May I ask a question? Is that all right?
Yeah, please.
We've focused on 2 stakeholders so far, but what's the role of Vivint and particularly Salt Lake County in this discussion currently and going forward?
We did talk with Vivint, and they are supportive of everything that's been going on. Of course, they are interested in seeing the development move forward, but are also supportive of Japantown. And I think that the county was an active participant in this and did come up with several ideas and potential funding sources. So I can see them participating in real ways moving forward. Certainly, I'm not in a position to commit for them, but just in watching them participate, they did come up with really substantive ideas and seem to see themselves as a stakeholder that will remain at the table for future discussions.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further before we move along? Okay. Thank you, Siobhan. Appreciate your work on this. Thanks, Corinne.
thank you very much.
All right, next up on our agenda today is the loan request for 55 West, 800 South, otherwise known as the Charlie. We're going to try and move this one along in 15 minutes if possible. So at the desk, I know we have Danny and Tammy Hunsaker, as well as, if I'm not mistaken, I see the property developer in the audience, so they may be available for questions as well. So go ahead, Danny.
In the interest of time, I'll turn it over to Tammy, and
Awesome.
I've advised her to be real quick. So if she starts lagging,
Tammy.
just
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
So very briefly, this, as was teed up, is a loan request from CW, the Charlie Partnership, which is a partnership between CW Urban and McKinley Partnership for a $2,335,000 loan for a residential condominium project located at 55 West, 800 South in the West Temple Gateway project area. The project will consist of a multifamily condominium project with 90 units ranging from studio 1-bedroom and 1+ bedroom. It will be the adaptive reuse of the former Taffytown building with a tower built to the south connected to the building. The tower will have a podium with 72 parking spaces and 5 stories above. The units will be priced between $245,000 and $444,000. The project is estimated to cost at about $23 million. CW Urban is looking to break ground late 2018. That could slip into early 2019 with a 15-month construction schedule. So really quickly, a financial overview of the site. The senior lender is coming in at about 75% of the project costs with the RDA loan at 10%, and the remainder being filled with developer partnership equity. And this RDA fund request really is needed to fill a financial gap that has been created by challenges acquiring conventional condominium construction funds. The market is very hesitant still to lend on condominium projects, and when they do, they typically lend at a smaller proportion of total project cost. So this is really to fill a gap with project financing. And the applicant has maximized the amount of senior financing they can get, and they're putting in 15% equity. A few renderings of the project, well, actually a site map of the project to orient you. This is, as I said, the former Taffytown building on 8 South and 55 West in the West Temple Gateway project area. A site map, it's hard to see, but the lighter cross-hatched square, that's the Taffytown building, and then the darker square, that will be the tower to the south. This is a rendering of what it will look like from Richard Street. A north elevation of the adaptive reuse of the Taffytown building, and an east elevation with the Taffytown building and the tower. So proposed terms of the loan, as I said, the loan amount will be up to $2,335,000. The interest rate the project qualifies for will be at 4.95%, and that's with 2 interest rate reductions as per RDA loan program policy. The project qualified for adaptive reuse write-down and an economic impact because of the development of an underutilized building. They're looking at a 36-month loan term, so that's just through construction and sale of the units. And it will be sufficiently collateralized and guaranteed through a personal guarantee from the CEO of CW Urban. With the project, it's meeting all RDA loan program policy with no exceptions. It's also providing additional public benefits to the neighborhood, adaptive reuse. It will preserve the building, the historical building typology and the identity and unique character of the neighborhood. It's a great building with 12-foot ceilings, a barrel roof inside. It was built in, I've heard 2 different years. It's either 1938 or 1940. Also, it will provide workforce housing. We did an internal analysis, and the majority of units will be sold at between $245,000 and $322,000, which is ranging between 90 and 125% of AMI. And it will also provide homeownership in a neighborhood that has a high concentration of rental housing, so it will provide some diversity in homeownership there. And as Danny said, I believe the development team is behind me, headed by Darlene Carter, the division director of CW Urban, and she has some of her team members with her if you have specific questions.
Tammy, can you talk to me about the loan fund and where this will leave the balance if we approve today?
I think Danny has a more accurate number than I do, but I believe it's around $9 million.
They are always happy to defer. We currently have 9.5 in our loan fund, and this would take us down to 7.2.
Okay. And with a 3-year turnaround with that? Erin Mendenhall, please.
Thank you. Before we have the applicant come up, could you elaborate on the 3.38 million component in the request that's in our transmittal?
3.38.
The gap financing equity commitment?
Oh, that's the equity commitment that the development partnership is bringing in. So that's 15% of the project cost. So the RDA loan would be $2,335,000, which would come in at about 10% of the total project cost.
So I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood the equity component. Tell me more about where that comes from.
That's essentially, oh, sorry, Tammy.
From the developer.
Okay.
That's their contribution,
Okay.
cash into the project.
Yeah, so even with a 15% equity contribution from the development team or partnership, there's still a financing gap where they've maximized the amount they can get from a bank, and they're putting in 15% of their own money essentially, and there's still a remaining gap. That's what the RDA would fill.
Okay. Thank you.
Danny and Tammy, before we bring up the developer, if we decide to, can you talk to me about whether or not a loan like this, which I'm supportive of, by the way, but just logistically and sort of high level, would this expose the redevelopment agency to any sort of liability? I know that the lending market for condominium development in particular has changed in recent years and tightened quite a bit. And so I wonder, and I also realize that certain courts have expanded liability issues when it comes to defects with construction. Just talk to me about any sort of liability that the RDA may be on the hook for.
Yeah, that's a tough question. That's a great question. And I will say this, and I assume Katie's sitting behind me and ready to jump up if I say something or she has anything to add. I don't believe this would expose the agency to any additional liability outside of just normal financing position on a project. Usually what you have with condominium projects and the liability that is happening is between the HOA and the contractor itself in terms of future lawsuits regarding the quality and craftsmanship of the project and going back and trying to extend those warranties that they provide within construction. So I don't see this as exposing us to anything outside of our normal lending criteria and risk position.
I should also mention the RDA Finance Committee reviewed this loan request, and they recommended approval of the terms as presented in your packet. And they actually looked at liability as an issue just in the expected profit to the developer. If, say, the market changed and the units weren't sold at a level that the developer is currently projecting, it would eat into the developer's profit, but the Finance Committee felt there was sufficient cushion there that the RDA would be sufficiently covered to have the loan repaid.
Great, thanks. Board members, any questions for staff, or if you would like me to bring up the developer, I can do that as well. Board member Johnston.
Thanks for this, and I think I approve of it overall. I don't understand how that price, is that for a single AMI, one person?
The units?
Yeah.
Oh, how it would?
Yeah, because workforce housing, I understand that you're talking 90% to 125%, but give me a sense of the breakdown of the units again, studio versus one plus.
Yeah, the more expensive units, so some of them are on the higher end of the price point at $444,000, I think is the maximum.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the units that are actually in the Taffytown building, the adaptive reuse. So they come with 12-foot ceilings and other amenities. But the vast majority of the units, I think about 75%, are priced at $322 and below. So I think there's 20, if I remember correctly, 26 units in the Taffytown building with the balance in the tower. So the majority of them are priced at 120% AMI and below.
Yeah, okay. The question I have then is about the home ownership piece. What prevents this from turning from a condo into a rental, to an apartment essentially?
That's a good question. I assume that would be something that the developer would potentially include within the CCNRs or the HOA documentation. I think that's a good question for the developer if they're going to include that provision within that to prevent that from happening and or limit it or provide that as an opportunity.
What prevents the developer themselves from not ever selling them though, or selling the entire building en masse as a rental?
I think that would be a condition of our loan agreement of whether, as part of us funding and continuing, that they have the obligation to pay us back, and that obligation comes with it to sell the units and basically pay us off with the sale of those. If the developer were to decide during construction that they were going to transfer this to be a rental project, that would be something that they would need to come and negotiate with us. We would have to approve because that would change the scope and the terms of our financing documents.
Does the RDA have any policy about supporting home ownership versus rental in our portfolio, or supporting? Do we have anything about that, I guess, at all?
Not outside of our normal adopting the GROW SLC policy and programs and guidelines. We don't have anything specific, no.
Okay. Well, I support the home ownership piece. I appreciate it. It's hard to find these days, as Chairperson Kitchen talked about. So, yeah, again, I guess I'm still just trying to grapple with the concept of workforce housing being at $322,000 for us. Studio or one bedroom at that level?
They range, but I think the $322,000 units were the 1+ bedroom. So they're not quite 2 bedroom, they're 1 bedroom with a bonus room.
All right, well, thank you.
And Andrew, I know that the 5-year growing SLC plan does call for a mixture of housing types at all price levels, so I think that this definitely fits within that scope. All right, board members, anything else? Staff?
We're good.
Okay, great. Let me look for, are we looking for a motion on this? Give me one sec. I do not have a motion sheet, but if a board member would like to, if there's any appetite for approval this afternoon, we can do that now. We could push it to a future agenda if you'd like, but it seems like we could move along today if we don't have any burning questions.
I can make a motion to approve, if I may, Chair. I would move that we approve the loan as it has been given to us today.
All right, it's been moved for approval by Board Vice Chair Fowler, a second by Board Member Luke. Any discussion on this item? All in favor?
Aye.
And that motion carries. Congratulations.
Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, we're going to move along to item number 5 on our agenda this afternoon, which is the CIP, RDA CIP. We have 10 minutes scheduled for this, but let's see what we can accomplish today. I know that there's some questions. So at the table we have Ben Ludke from the council office, Danny from the RDA, and maybe we'll just let Ben take it away at first, if you don't mind. Thanks.
The board discussed the 5 RDA capital projects last month, and based on the board's discussion, there is a motion sheet in your packet, and I'm pulling it up right now. It includes an option to approve the RDA capital projects as requested, with the change that the RDA board discussed of the taking $100,000 from the downtown placemaking incentive program and instead using it for the 100 South Streetscape improvement studies related to Japantown. There's also an option to approve some of the projects with the exception of Station Center infrastructure and 650 South new track station, and the reason those are listed as exceptions is the board had several questions on both of those projects at the October briefing, and the questions were related to the uncertainty about the total cost for each of the projects as well as coordination, especially with UTA on the new track station. And so if there are additional questions, now is a chance to ask RDA staff, otherwise we can entertain one of the motions on the motion sheet.
I can see Board Member Mendenhall maybe has a question.
I do, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I have more of a statement around the 650 South Main Street Light Rail Station, which is that I'm not in support of this. Particularly, we have just finalized 2 project areas that have been years in the making on the 9-line project area and State Street project area. And there have been, I think in the 5 years I've been an RDA board member, I've heard more conversations around a 17th South potential track stop station that's associated with the Salt Lake Community College population that comes in from all over the valley to take classes there at 1700 South. In addition, we have an existing project area abutting that. So anyway, the idea of a 650 South Main Street light rail station that is really at the behest of a private property owner or developer. I don't have any interest in this in a budget amendment. If this is a need that UTA also recognizes and that UTA plans to take care of the O&M of this kind of a station, I understand that there's major congestion issues north in this area on the light rail line. That it is another reason I don't support this budget amendment proposal. I think there's a lot more conversation we could have, and I'm open to having that conversation. But to do this in a budget amendment, I'm not interested at all. So I will be either making a motion or looking to support a motion that doesn't include this allocation.
Thank you for your 2 cents, Board Member Mendenhall. Anybody else have anything on CIP? Board Member Johnston.
I agree with Councilmember Mendenhall on this one.
Easy enough. Well, no other questions. I'll look for a proposed motion.
I'll make a motion which will be motion 2 on our motion sheet, to approve some projects with changes. I move that the board approve some of the capital project funding allocations as requested by the administration as shown on this motion sheet. Mr. Chair, would you like me to go through them?
I would like that, please.
The first is the Downtown Placemaking Incentive Program at $244,356. Second is First South Streetscape Improvement Study. I want to be specific that this is between Second West and Third West, and that will come from the CBD. And that's from the placemaking funding, which it doesn't say specifically on the motion sheet, but that's our intention, isn't it?
It is indeed.
And the third is the North Temple School Fund at $31,800. The fourth is 300 West Streetscape Phase 2 at $400,754, and no appropriation for Station Center infrastructure and 650 South Main Street Light Rail Station. That is all.
Quick question for the board. Is everybody else opposed to the Station Center infrastructure funding as well? Are there questions? Would we like to maybe allow
Do you want to
Danny?
make a friendly amendment?
What's that?
Do you want to make a friendly?
Well, I'd like to maybe hear from Danny, and then we could look at maybe a friendly amendment after that.
The purpose of this request within our annual budget was to essentially set aside the funds. Given that this was the last year for the West Temple Gateway project area, we felt that this would be a project that we may want to set aside the funds and explore the possibility of whether that station was warranted and or whether UTA actually wanted to incorporate it. So we as staff have no problem at this point with not allocating those funds for the specific project. However, I'd request that those funds sit there until we can come back to the board with information after we've reached out to UTA, after we've reached out to some of the property owners and stakeholders that we've heard from, and then provide the information at that time of whether this is something that could fit within the light rail plan and or if it's something that we want to make a priority decision on this station over another. So,
Do you want to speak to the Station Center infrastructure?
Same thing with Station Center in terms of coming back with the budget amendment and requesting that the funds for the Station Center infrastructure be allocated. This request was essentially just an allocation of a portion of the Depot District annual budget in anticipation of not necessarily having those final costs yet. We wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to have enough funds set aside. And again, we would come back to the board with what that final cost is and ask the board at that time to allocate those funds. So again, we're fine with these funds not being allocated today as much as if they can sit in the holding account and wait for us to come back and provide that information to make that decision.
Great. Then I do not have an amendment to offer.
Would anybody like me to amend my motion so that we take the $400,000 from the Station Center infrastructure project proposal and the $558,000 from the Main Street Light Rail Station, which totals $958,000 and change, and divide that in two to be seed money for the 9-line and State Street project areas, or do we want to have that conversation later? Then I'll continue with my motion as proposed.
And we'll need a second if we're going to move forward on that. All right, it's been moved by Board Member Mendenhall and second by Board Member Luke, and we're going to open this up for discussion. We'll go to our board members first. Any discussion on this? Okay, staff, go ahead.
The only thing I would say is because those are funds allocated from the specific property tax increment of the project areas, they are not able to be spent as seed money in other project areas.
Thank you. We'll have another
I'm unclear
discussion.
about the track station funding. Is that from?
West Temple Gateway.
Okay, we'll have to confirm that. That's different than I remember it, but.
I think one of the wrinkles in this particular instance is that the State Street project area was extended to overlap with the West Temple Gateway project area, and I'm unclear on what flexibility might exist once that project area has expired, since there is the overlap, if some of those tax increment funds could also be used in the new project area of State Street.
Yeah.
That's, I
Well,
think,
we'll just
if
leave
we
it.
could
Need more time.
Good wrinkle. That's a good wrinkle, but.
Well, iron wrinkles later.
Okay. All those in favor of this motion?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that carries, and we are good with CIP for today. Next on our agenda is the Affordable Housing Coordination conversation. Hold on really quick. All right. So we have this time stamped for 30 minutes. We're going to do our best to keep the housing conversation within that time period. So let's kick it off today with, I don't have my names agenda. We have Tammy Hunsaker, Danny Waltz, and I don't see Melissa Jensen in the audience, but I do see Tony Milner and others from. Oh, she's on her way. Okay,
She was probably
great.
listening in.
Well, do we want to give Melissa a moment to come, or do you want to jump right in?
We can set the stage. We've provided for her her comments after Tammy speaks, and just to set the stage in terms of this item, this is a follow-up to previous board discussions as the agency has worked towards adopting a housing allocation funding policy. And this was the request from the board as we came before you back in May in terms of trying to understand the different roles and responsibilities of RDA in hand, the projects and programs that we have, as well as the funding sources that are provided for those. So having said that, I'll turn it over to Tammy, who will give a little bit of the background and definition. And then at that point, I'm sure we'll have Melissa joining us, and she can jump in and present her information.
Thanks, Danny. Yes, the ultimate goal of what we're doing here is to draft an RDA housing funding allocation. Actually, as motioned by the board last December, you asked us to come back with a policy. And in carrying out that process, we've provided a briefing to you on statutory housing requirements and past practice. So this is a follow-up to that discussion that talks about coordination between the RDA and hand. And then the next step will be to come back with an actual draft of the policy. So in your memo, we have broken down kind of hand focus areas and RDA focused areas. Hand's areas range from citywide housing plan and policy development to program activities to developing actual projects. Their focus areas in a nutshell are the HUD programs, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So they administer CDBG, Home, ESG, and HOPWA. They expand homeownership opportunities through mortgage financing and the Community Land Trust. They provide critical improvements to homeowners of existing housing, low and moderate income homeowners through home repair programs, and obviously gap financing through the Housing Trust Fund. In addition, they utilize city-owned property, disposing that to promote the city's housing goals, including affordable housing. So HAND's programs really range from service delivery and working with partnership organizations to working with homeowners to working with development partners. Whereas the RDA's focus area is really on development projects, on real estate transactions, and our focus areas are a little bit different. We look at the needs of individual project areas and really try to tailor housing needs to different areas. So that could be anything from ensuring that project areas have an adequate supply of affordable housing as our activities occur and neighborhood change occurs. We implement mixed income housing in project areas to provide economic diversity of housing, to make sure there's a mix in neighborhoods. In certain neighborhoods like West Capitol Hill, we'll foster historic preservation and stabilization of the existing housing stock, and will support additional housing stock just to get increased population and vitality within our project areas. One of our other priorities is to ensure the growth of the tax base and generation of additional tax increment in project areas, so that not only keeps our funds sustainable, but it spins off additional affordable housing funds. We support the needs and objectives of our taxing entity partners. In fact, we recently met with the Salt Lake City School District for our project area creation activities, and they expressed a need for workforce housing within project areas to support housing for teachers and their staff, and also family housing for students. So we look at taxing entity partners' priorities. And then under the umbrella of economic development, we also look at furthering the city's economic development goals through housing. And of course, we are also able to spend housing funds outside of project areas to support citywide housing goals and implementation of growing SLC. So while our programs are very different and our priorities are very different, there are areas where our priorities and programs overlap. And this is primarily seen in gap financing provided through the Housing Trust Fund, the RDA's loan program, and we also have the NOFA and the renovation pilot program. So these programs have very different objectives and priorities, but they all can provide gap financing for housing development. I also would like to point out that there has been increased interdepartmental coordination between HAND and the RDA. Melissa, the director of HAND, sits on the RDA's 7-member finance committee. So reviewing loan requests and tax increment, Melissa's there participating in those conversations. And then committee participation. We've been participating in each other's selection committees. RDA staff sits on the Fleet Block Development Committee. HAND staff has sat on the selection committee for the overnighter site and 255 State Street. And likewise, RDA staff has participated in selection committees that HAND has run, like the Barnes Bank redevelopment. So there has been a lot of coordination between the two departments. We also, the RDA, when we look to dispose of a property before we market that property, we evaluate the property to see if the inclusion of affordable housing is appropriate for that site. And part of that process is reaching out to HAND to get their opinion on the particular site. And if housing is deemed to be appropriate for that site, for example, the overnighter and State Street properties, we work with HAND to dial in the level of affordability in the AMI mix that we're requesting through the disposition process. So there's been quite a bit of collaboration between our two organizations. Recent projects we've actually closely worked on is the Exchange, the Barnes Bank redevelopment. Another project that has been open for a while now was 9th East Lofts. That was an RDA-led project, but HAND participated through a loan through the Housing Trust Fund. So in your packet, there's a lot of words on it, and I think you have a copy that's hopefully a little bit easier to read, but we have provided a housing programs and tools matrix that provides an overview of all of the housing programs that the RDA and HAND has. There's quite a few. Most of them are HAND's. The RDA has 4. So I'll go through RDA's 4 and then turn it over to Melissa. So we have the RDA loan program that we just funded the Charlie out of. So that can be used for affordable housing, market rate housing, commercial development, all sorts of different development projects. So we don't really have an AMI max with the RDA loan program, but if the project has 60% AMI and below, there's an interest rate reduction, so there's an incentive there. We have the tax increment reimbursement program, so that's committing future tax increment to the project. We've funded affordable housing projects through that. One of the examples of that is Art Space Commons in the Granary District. There's an annual reimbursement going out to that project. Property acquisition and disposition, recent examples again, the overnighter and 255 State Street. So we'll acquire property for the purpose of disposing for affordable housing. And then, as you all are aware, we had the $10 million notice of funding availability for affordable housing. We've committed $5.5 million of that, and we have now released the $4.5 million NOFA for areas of opportunity. And that program, really, the policies for that one were tailored to incentivize more deeply affordable housing, lower AMIs through the NOFA. And I will turn it over to Melissa to talk about HAND's programs.
Hi, thank you. So I won't go into great detail on all of these. I think there's kind of 2 categories here, and that is sort of our federally funded programs, and then of course our generally funded programs. And I'll kind of focus on those because I think that's where some of the overlap is. I think it's an important note to note that on some of the recent sort of areas where we overlap or collaborate have been driven by one-time funding, such as the renovation pilot and the 4.5 and some of those. So I think that that's unique in its time and context, whereas some of the other funds like the revolving loan fund of the RDA and the Housing Trust Fund are more consistent funding sources that we generate and work together on. So of course you have the Housing Trust Fund. That is traditionally gap financing, but I would say in a different way than the RDA funds is. It's generally viewed as a subsidy. Oftentimes it's soft loans or very low interest rate. For some of our permanent supportive housing, it's no interest rate, and sometimes on those we don't anticipate getting paid back, although we do formal notes and loan agreements. So that tends to be the purpose, because we are targeting, at minimum 60% AMI and below. The renovation pilot program, we have recently awarded those. You will get a full transmittal on that as an update, but that was a result of a council-driven sort of funding allocation. The Community Land Trust is both. We use federal funds, but then also, as you know, we recently allocated sales tax dollars to the Community Land Trust. So that's where you'll kind of see a convergence of different funding sources. And then, of course, all of the sales tax dollars that are going to be and are being implemented at this time for new programs is obviously very different. We really look for gaps in our federal funding and where we could see those dollars most leveraged. So I'm happy to take questions on any of the programs, but I thought I would focus on ones that weren't federally funded. As this body knows, those are very highly regulated and determined. That policy is sort of written for us.
Board members. Board Member Fowler, please.
Okay, I have a couple of things, but we're going to keep this quick because I think that I anticipate us having a lot more discussions on housing and these policies as we kind of move forward, especially, and I've been thinking about this recently with the new sales tax money and where exactly that's going to go and how we're going to keep track of that and monitor that and make sure that we are using that, and then what role RDA plays in their availability of money and sort of, I think there's going to be some interesting policy questions coming up as we start to look into that a little bit. So we kind of wanted to, we had talked about it yesterday at our chair-vice chair meeting of just, this was sort of a brief overview so that we as board members could start thinking about some of those policy discussions and questions that I think will be coming up and that we've talked about. But so that was more just a statement than a question and sort of, I guess, a heads up more than anything. And then the other thing I wanted to say is, Tammy, I love your chart and I appreciate all of the work that you put into this. I was actually just like fantasizing about it last night because I was thinking about all of this. And so just like it's stuck in my brain, and you've really outdid yourself on all the work on this. So thank you for pulling all of this together for us. It really lays it out quite nicely in a way that for me I can understand and, like I said, visualize and think about at 2 o'clock in the morning, like is what happens. So thanks again, and I think that's all I wanted to say.
Anything else, board members? It's a big conversation here. All right, Board Member Mendenhall.
Thank you. And in anticipation of broader discussions, I think that I would like to have a discussion about where there is some overlap in the functions of RDA financing and hand financing, particularly around gap financing, and whether or not we should differentiate those respective funding pools through policy at the RDA level, perhaps, or hand, and we can have that discussion.
Yeah, at a high level, I guess I would say there is overlap in that they both provide gap financing, but RDA loan program policies really drafted it's not as friendly to deeply affordable housing projects. As Melissa spoke, usually affordable housing projects with very low AMIs need like a cash flow loan, very low interest rate or no interest rate, deeply subsidized loan, whereas RDA loan program policy, we have a base interest rate and we have interest rate reductions, but by standard policy, you can't get below the U.S. Treasury yield. However, we have funded affordable housing projects through the RDA loan program, but it takes exceptions, you approving exceptions to the standard RDA loan program policy. So RDA loan program can do affordable housing loans, but we target market rate, commercial, all sorts of different types of loans, whereas the niche for affordable housing loans really is more the Housing Trust Fund.
And you have respective advisory committees, right? We have RAC and Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee. Is that the name of it?
It's a board. It's a constituent board, which means their recommendation comes to you for final approval of all loans.
So can you just give me a snippet, or you could tell me, we can address this next time, of how those those board conversations either intersect or don't, or where there might be some potential for cross-pollination when a project maybe fits better with another one, and hopefully it doesn't get to the point that it's at the advisory committee in the wrong place. But did your process uncover any opportunities there?
Yeah, I think with the increased collaboration between our groups, there's more dialogue on what funding source or what application process would better suit the project. For example, when it became apparent that the exchange needed additional gap financing than what the RDA board approved through the 21 million, you had approved 1.4 million pending an application process, but it was apparent that the gap was more like 3 million. So at one time they thought about the Housing Trust Fund, but we thought, well, that's kind of silly because then they'd have to carry out 2 different application processes, 2 different loan documents. So they came to the RDA for the additional gap. So there is more dialogue between us in helping our applicants and supporting the project.
I appreciate that, but I think that our job at this desk is to ensure that when Tammy and Melissa and Danny are gone, that there's something in policy that ensures we're being the most efficient and collaborative to do the best with the taxpayer dollars. And so maybe at the next conversation, we can talk more about how to solidify those improvements that have come from this process that right now are working with you as individuals, but in the future, when different people are in different positions, we want to make sure those efficiencies are there, right?
May I just add? For the Housing Trust Fund, it's largely driven by the ordinance, the Housing Trust Fund ordinance, which lays out our AMIs, et cetera. And one of the things that we've talked about in housing and neighborhood development for some time is, does that need to be resurfaced and relooked at? So we would certainly take the opportunity to work based on direction that you might have with some updates. For example, it allows for some single-family home financing that's never used because it doesn't make a lot of sense to go through our process for $20,000 or something like that. So I think it's, for us, from our perspective, that has been our primary guiding document. And then layering on growing SLC and sort of the priorities that the City Council has set out for funding, but certainly would welcome continued conversation about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Board Member Johnston.
Maybe echoing what she just said, but is it in policy that you're making sure that each of their staffs are involved in your working groups, or is that just your current process?
Process and practice. I don't think it's, for housing and neighborhood development, we don't have a specific. So first of all, the Housing Trust Fund does not have a representative from the RDA, right? That's a full constituent-led board. For our internal committees, it's for housing and neighborhood development has been practice.
I think from my perspective, and echoing what Councilperson Mendenhall said, it would be helpful to maybe think through that process a little bit. I think as effective as anything might be, it's having each other on those committees talking to each other and saying, look, I know what we're talking about here. I know what you're talking about. So it's a thought. I don't want to tie anybody's hands and say you have to do certain things. But it may be the simplest solution to coordination that we could have, frankly.
Chris, do you have anything to add?
Return on investment. So how do we make sure, and would it be helpful to do a survey over the past 5 or 10 years of housing to Housing Trust Fund and the Revolving Loan Fund to track performance and return on investment for the city?
When you say return on investment, what does that mean to you, Board Member Wharton?
Well, I would just like to make sure that I would like to know what kind of impact we've made and like how that fits into like, are all the investments that we made able to stay as affordable housing? Are we already going through the first generation and moving on to now market rate? things like that.
So not necessarily cash return.
Right. That's what I would like to know.
Jennifer,
Wanted
if
to
you
clarify.
want to jump in really quick and add.
I mean, just based on some past councils that have asked to track metrics, I think that one is that they talked about the people and tracking the people and, you know, what happened to the people, but actually previous councils were interested in the cash return because of the revolving nature of it, right? And at a certain point, if you don't have any cash return, you lose, you know, your revolving nature of it. And so kind of how do you track that over time and making sure you're balancing the low to no interest loans with the sort of loans that make a return. So I don't know if you guys have tracked that over the years or.
I think, I don't want to speak for Danny, but I think the RDA could compile that information fairly quickly.
That answer your question for now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So can we talk about housing money allocation from the redevelopment agency? It's been a historic practice that we set aside 10%. I believe that the board at one point did request to have a more formal conversation so that we could get this practice codified. Can you talk to me about, this is a question for RDA, can you talk to me about where that policy conversation is in your preparation and when we might be able to have that formal dialogue?
You're having that conversation.
Is that what you're looking for right now?
When we brought that to you in May, this was one of the speaking points at that time, that you wanted to understand how the RDA and HAND's roles kind of intersected, coordinated, and so prior to deciding on that policy, we came back with this information. This discussion and these points will then be taken, and our next step would be to come back with that housing allocation funding policy that incorporates any comments or direction that we receive as part of this conversation. So if this is something that we want additional information or to carry over this conversation, then I think that would be helpful for staff to understand what additional information the board would want so that we can then finalize that policy and bring it back in the format that you'd like to see it.
So, hold really fast. Go ahead. Yes, it's so Amy was asking for a point of clarification on my question about 10%, and I just want to say that historically in our project areas we've set aside 10%, and oftentimes it goes to the citywide housing or the trust fund. So Jennifer, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think in the spirit of that this is maybe the first of many conversations, I think the first step was sort of establishing the baseline of what we have, because we didn't have it all in one place, and it's nice to have it all in one place now. And so maybe now that board members have received all the information, the next conversation can be more focused on individual feedback about areas that you want to see enhanced, or areas that, like the single family home program, might not be a focus of the city anymore based on, you know, progress. I think that would be hugely informed by some data about the previous 5 years of activity and what programs are more successful, and from different metrics, right? There's different ways to define success, so maybe that's up to you guys too. And then maybe when we get that information, we can schedule the next conversation, and
Great.
I don't know.
And I think that at some point down the road, and I'm looking to our vice chair here as well to be a champion for this going forward, but I think it may be worthwhile to have some agenda time at an RDA meeting in the future to talk specifically about our commitment in tax increment terms going forward, and how we can get that codified more specifically for housing. And so maybe if RDA staff wants to provide any sort of additional information on what our historic practice has been and where those resources have gone and what our general sense on the impact has been with those resources, that might be helpful for us to maybe generate more pointed questions on a policy conversation down the road. And I would also encourage other board members maybe to come up with some thoughts in the interim on that as well. Anybody else? Would you like to speak to policy questions on this or something else?
Just a clarification, Mr. Chair, on your 10%. Are you talking about the discussion about where that level should be put, be set aside, or are you talking about how it's allocated, or both?
My understanding is that there's no formal policy guiding us, that it's only been a historic practice.
Guiding in terms of if it goes to an account in the RDA called
Yes.
citywide housing, or if
Okay.
it goes to the housing trust fund.
Because it is policy, you have to, by state law, you have to set
It's
aside 10%.
project
Right,
area
but-
by project area, I
That's
believe.
my question about,
Yeah.
are you talking
But the
about
state law
going
doesn't,
higher?
no, the
or-
state law doesn't dictate where it goes.
Yes, but where it goes is our,
Right.
that's my.
And
so-
to clarify, each project area, well, the requirement varies. It depends on the statute that was in place the year the project area was adopted. So our new State Street and 9-Line project area, the requirement's 10%. Gateway, North Temple, and Depot is 20%. And then CBD, there's actually no requirement, but the RDA board has traditionally allocated a minimum of 10% from each project area.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Let's go to Board Member Johnson, or Board Member Rogers.
Yeah, we also have this discussion of, well, policy discussion on money coming towards us for the Northwest Quadrant, the 10% for housing on that. So that's another thing that we need to discuss is, I mean, it really is coming from an RDA area, right? So we need to put that on the agenda for discussion as well and actually have some sort of foresight to see what are we looking at in terms of money that we could be receiving.
I think that's a really good point because we almost didn't have that 10% from the Northwest Quad Inland Port area. So I think that that's a success for the City Council and the RDA board to really determine how that is spent going forward, because in the next couple of decades that could be $100 million or more. So that's sizable. So I agree. So that's definitely a point of action going forward. Board Member Fowler, do you have any questions?
I think Jen is absolutely right that I appreciate this sort of high level, this is going to be on our radar, I think, quite a bit. And Councilmember Rogers bringing up the 10% out of the Northwest Quadrant. I think it will also be an interesting discussion and something we maybe should think about as board members of what this policy will look like as it relates to what we've dedicated with sales tax revenue to affordable housing. And I think that those two policies, we'll need to take kind of a little bit bigger look at those two things. So it's been in my head about how those two will relate together, and maybe something as we continue to move forward with these discussions we can all kind of think about. And again, that's another heads up to all of you that this is what I've been thinking about. But
Any policy questions? Anything further for right now? All right. That was quick. I was expecting another couple, so I think we're good. Well, that was nice. Thank you for putting this together. And can I make a gentle request that Melissa and Danny, you turn to each other and give each other a high five or a fist bump or something? Because this was rough at first, and look at where we've come. So thank you very much.
Should be Tammy doing carried this item.
And okay, we're gonna just give RDA staff a moment, maybe just 3 minutes to jump into Regent Street Public Art if you wanted to say a thing or two. If not, we could skip
Regent
it.
Street Public Art, what we just want to add is that contract is close to being fully executed and in place. I think there was a question in our meeting yesterday in terms of the costs, and I wanted to clarify that the original allocation of $2.2 million, that includes $2 million for the contract itself. And then the balance of funds are available as a contingency. And if they're not used as a contingency, we have an agreement in place to utilize those on the plaza in support of the art. And that can be everything from additional art, signage, placemaking, whatever. So
that's 200,000 for
200 plus thousand.
Okay.
So we built that into the process where we're able to use that both as a contingency and for the project.
Great.
So I wanted to give that information.
Do you have a timeline on the project?
We have a timeline. Amanda, what's our timeline? Starting in February. Fabrication and installation.
Yeah, Board Member Mendenhall.
So NEDCON does fascinating stuff, and I'm wondering if we know if it's going to be in the fog, water, light, wind, or sand realm. The wind realm, okay. And is this something... we had talked previously and with previous artist discussions around this being something above the public right-of-way, sort of.
In the air.
But his stuff is mostly mounted to
Yeah, it's on the side of the Walker Center.
Okay.
Parking garage. So I appreciate you asking that, because that way Kat and Kelsey had a reason to be here and answer that question. So
thank you for being here.
Because I had no idea.
Okay, since you're here, do you want to give us any announcements?
Just one announcement of personal privilege, and that is to thank you. So on behalf of the RDA, we have a gift for you. We are excited and want to congratulate you for your next opportunity, but very sad to see you go. And so we understand, no, please.
Wow, thank
we
you.
understand, some by personal experience, others by rumor and stories, that it may get a little chilly up on the hill from time to time. So I'll leave that to your own personal interpretation, but we wanted to give you at least a small gesture of our appreciation for your involvement, not only on the City Council, but the RDA Board and as our chair. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
We opted not to get the Snuggie, just the blanket.
No, oh, this is not a Snuggie. Well, I have a good tailor, so I think we're good.
So, and unless there's any questions for me, we are done.
No, thank you very much to all the staff. I've really enjoyed my time serving as the RDA board chair and the vice chair before this. So thank you for putting up with me.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
In that case, we will move on to item number 9 and our final item on the agenda today, which is an announcement from our vice chair, Amy Fowler.
Yay, my turn. So I am going to take this last opportunity to say thank you to Derek for being the RDA chair this last year. Obviously, this was my first year on the council and certainly my first year as a RDA board member, let alone in leadership with it all. And you have been an amazing mentor and guide and a wealth of knowledge as we have, and so incredibly kind and sincere and generous. Every time I ask some dumb question, you never make it seem like a dumb question and give the most positive and, like I said, sincere and genuine answer. And I cannot tell you how much I've appreciated that, and I've appreciated our friendship and growing to know you and getting to work on these projects with you. And for everyone out there, some of the things that Derek has been able to do as RDA chair is help to finalize and adopt 3 different community reinvestment areas: the State Street, the 9 Line, and the Northwest Quadrant. He has certainly helped advance our board's goals for community benefit and economic development. One of the things that I think Derek should be most proud of is helping with the mural project and getting that going and off the ground. And it was so much fun to walk around that day and go to each and every one of the murals with Derek and the other RDA staff and all of our community members, and really appreciate and enjoy a district that was forgotten about for a minute, with a lot of amazing art and beautiful talent and awesome people and fun. So you should certainly be incredibly proud of that. And obviously the huge thing that the council did before we new council members came on was allocating that very large chunk of money to affordable housing, really pushing our goals to create a better and more welcoming city to everyone, so that we have everyone stay and enjoy the city that we all love so much. You've helped to really push those goals forward, and I have no doubt in my mind that you will do just the same up on the Hill, as much as humanly possible as a Democrat can do, as you move forward and build bridges and work very hard, not only for our city, but for our state. So congratulations to you, and thank you so very much for everything you've taught me.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our RDA meeting. Thank you very much.
Could we start the council meeting at 4:15? So
Absolutely.
because we have a hard stop at 6 o'clock to have a dinner downstairs celebrating Councilmember Kitchen. So
Wow,
if
big day, huh?
y'all don't mind, 10-minute break and we'll come back to council.
That sounds great. We've got 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks.